When the search and rescue teams found the abandoned snowmobile half buried in a drift 3 miles from the Alaskan research station, they assumed the worst. Dr. Sarah Chen had been missing for 48 hours, in temperatures that dropped to minus 30 degrees. The blizzard had been so fierce that even the most experienced Arctic survival experts wouldn't venture outside. Her colleagues at the remote weather monitoring facility had given up hope. But what they didn't know was that Sarah wasn't lost at all. She was about to become the most unlikely hero in Navy SEAL history. 200 miles away, a classified military operation was falling apart. A team of elite SEALs had crash-landed during a routine training mission when their helicopter's navigation systems failed in the same storm that swallowed Sarah. Now they were trapped in a landscape so hostile that their survival training seemed useless against nature's fury. The woman they thought was dead was about to save their lives. This is the story of how a quiet meteorologist with a fear of confined spaces became a legend whispered about in military circles. How 48 hours of being presumed dead taught her that sometimes the only way out is through. And how the worst blizzard in Alaska's recorded history became the backdrop for one of the most extraordinary rescue missions ever documented. What happened in those 2 days would change everything Sarah thought she knew about herself, and it would give 6 Navy SEALs a story they would never be allowed to tell officially, but would never forget as long as they lived. Dr. Sarah Chen had always been the type of person who checked her equipment twice and her weather reports 3 times. At 34, she had spent the better part of a decade studying extreme weather patterns in some of the most isolated places on Earth. The Kotzebue Research Station in northern Alaska was supposed to be routine work, just another 3-month assignment monitoring atmospheric conditions for the National Weather Service. She had arrived at the station in early November, settling into the small but well-equipped facility alongside Dr. Gerbs. Marcus Webb, a veteran climatologist who had been working Arctic assignments for 15 years, and James Rodriguez, a communications specialist who kept them connected to the outside world. The station sat on a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of the Arctic tundra, a lonely outpost where the nearest neighbor was over 60 miles away. Sarah loved the isolation. It gave her space to think, to focus on her research, without the distractions of city life. She had grown up in suburban Portland, the daughter of 2 engineers who had instilled in her a methodical approach to everything. Her colleagues often joked that she could probably survive a zombie apocalypse just by making detailed lists and following proper procedures. But procedures meant nothing when nature decided to rewrite the rules. The morning of November 15th started like any other. Sarah woke at 6:30, checked the overnight readings from their weather monitoring equipment, and prepared her daily report. The forecast called for heavy snow, but nothing they hadn't handled before. Arctic weather was unpredictable, but the station was built to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a hurricane. What the forecast didn't mention was that 3 separate weather systems were converging over northern Alaska, creating what meteorologists would later call a perfect storm scenario. By noon, the wind had picked up to 40 miles per hour. By 2 in the afternoon, visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. Marcus was the first to suggest they might have a problem. "Sarah, you need to look at these pressure readings," he called from his monitoring station. "I've never seen anything like this." Sarah crossed the small main room of the station and peered over his shoulder at the computer screen. The atmospheric pressure was dropping at a rate that should have been impossible. The wind speed readings were climbing toward numbers that their equipment wasn't designed to measure. "This isn't in any of the models," she said, pulling up the satellite imagery on her own computer. The storm system stretching across the screen looked like a massive spiral of white death, covering an area larger than most states. By 4 o'clock, they had lost satellite communication. By 5, the backup generator had kicked in as the main power lines went down. By 6, even Marcus, with all his experience, was admitting that this storm was unlike anything he had ever seen. That was when Sarah made the decision that would change everything. Their emergency supply cache was located in a separate building about a quarter-mile from the main station. It contained enough food, water, and medical supplies to keep the 3 of them alive for 2 weeks if the main facility was compromised. Standard protocol called for retrieving those supplies before any storm that might last more than 24 hours. The problem was that nobody had expected this storm to intensify so quickly. What had looked like a routine snowfall that morning was now showing all the signs of becoming a multi-day blizzard that could bury the entire station. "I'm going to get the emergency supplies," Sarah announced, pulling on her heaviest parka. James looked up from the radio equipment he had been frantically trying to repair. Are you insane? You can't see 10 feet out there. That's exactly why we need those supplies now, Sarah replied, checking her GPS unit and emergency beacon. If this storm gets any worse, we won't be able to get to them at all. Marcus tried to talk her out of it. He pointed out that they had enough food for several days, that the storm might blow over by morning, that risking her life for supplies they might not even need was the kind of mistake that turned routine assignments into tragedies. But Sarah had studied the data. The storm wasn't going to blow over. If anything, it was going to get worse. And she was the youngest, the fittest, and the most experienced with Arctic survival techniques. If anyone was going to make that quarter-mile journey and back, it had to be her. She spent 20 minutes preparing for what should have been a simple trip. She strapped on snowshoes, activated her emergency beacon, and programmed her GPS with waypoints for both the supply cache and the return journey. She carried 2 flashlights, a flare gun, and enough emergency rations for 24 hours just in case. The last thing she said to Marcus and James was, "If I'm not back in 2 hours, don't come looking for me. Wait for the storm to pass." She stepped outside at 7:15 in the evening. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Even through her layers of Arctic gear, the wind cut through her clothing with a viciousness that took her breath away. The snow wasn't falling so much as flying horizontally, driven by gusts that she later estimated reached 70 miles per hour. She had taken similar trips dozens of times. A quarter mile was nothing, barely a 10-minute walk under normal conditions. She had GPS. She had landmarks. She had every piece of safety equipment recommended by Arctic survival experts. What she didn't have was any way to predict that the storm would intensify even further over the next hour, turning what was already a dangerous situation into something approaching supernatural fury. Sarah made it to the supply cache. The building was a reinforced concrete structure designed to withstand Arctic conditions, and it took her several minutes to dig through the snow that had already accumulated around the door. Inside, she loaded a sled with the supplies they would need: medical kit, extra food, backup communication equipment, and additional fuel for their generator. The return journey should have taken 15 minutes, even pulling the sled through the snow. She never made it back. Somewhere between the supply cache and the main station, in a landscape that had become an alien world of white and wind, Sarah Chen vanished. The GPS signal from her emergency beacon disappeared at 8:43 p.m. Her snowshoe tracks were erased by drifting snow within minutes. Marcus and James waited through the night, taking turns at the radio, trying to raise someone, anyone, who might be able to help. But the storm had knocked out communications across 1,000 square miles of Alaska. They were as isolated as if they had been on the moon. When morning came, the storm was still raging. Sarah had been missing for over 12 hours. Even if she had found shelter somewhere, the cold would be killing her by degrees. The human body wasn't designed to survive those temperatures for extended periods, no matter how much gear you had. By the second morning, Marcus and James had accepted that their colleague was dead. They had lost their most experienced member to a storm that showed no signs of ending. Their own situation was becoming desperate as their fuel supplies dwindled and the snow continued to pile up around the station. But 200 miles to the east, Sarah Chen was very much alive. And she was about to stumble onto a situation that would test every survival skill she had ever learned and some she didn't know she had. The helicopter had gone down just after midnight on the second day of the storm. The 6 Navy SEALs aboard had been conducting a routine training exercise, practicing navigation and survival techniques in extreme weather conditions. They were some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, men who had survived combat in deserts and jungles, who could operate in conditions that would kill ordinary people. But the Arctic didn't care about their training. When their helicopter's instruments failed and they crashed into a ravine 50 miles from the nearest road, they found themselves in a survival situation that their manuals had never adequately prepared them for. Their pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Rick Martinez, had managed to bring the aircraft down without killing anyone. But the crash had damaged their emergency beacon and destroyed most of their cold weather gear. They had shelter in the form of the damaged helicopter, but no way to signal for rescue, and limited supplies in the middle of a storm that meteorologists would later describe as a once-in-a-century event. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander David Hayes, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. He had led his men through firefights and terrorist attacks, had been decorated for bravery under fire. But as he looked around the crash site at his 5 men, he realized that all his combat experience might not be enough to keep them alive in this frozen hell. The SEALs were trained for survival. They knew how to find food, how to build shelter, how to signal for rescue. But their training assumed certain baseline conditions that simply didn't exist in an Arctic blizzard. They needed heat, and their fuel was limited. They needed rescue, but their communications were down. They needed to stay alive long enough for the storm to pass, but no one knew how long that might be. What they didn't know was that help was coming from the most unlikely source imaginable. Sarah Chen was out there in the storm, and she wasn't dead. She was learning things about herself that would have seemed impossible just days before. She was discovering that sometimes the person you think you are isn't the person you become when everything is on the line. And in a few hours, she would walk out of that blizzard like something from a legend, carrying news of 6 stranded soldiers who needed her help more than they would ever admit. But first, she had to survive the night that should have killed her. The moment Sarah Chen realized she was lost, a cold that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind settled in her chest. She had been pulling the supply sled for what felt like hours, following her GPS religiously, but the landscape around her bore no resemblance to anything she remembered from the trip to the cache. The storm had transformed the world into something alien and hostile. Landmarks that had been clear that afternoon were now buried under feet of snow or rendered invisible by the driving wind. Her GPS unit showed her position, but the numbers on the screen seemed meaningless when every direction looked exactly the same, a wall of white that swallowed her flashlight beam after just a few feet. She stopped and tried to think through her situation logically. She was a scientist, trained to analyze problems methodically. Panic was the enemy of survival. She needed to assess what she had, what she needed, and what her options were. Her supplies were limited but adequate for a short-term emergency. She had high-energy food bars, a thermos of hot coffee that was still warm, emergency hand warmers, and enough battery power in her flashlights to last several hours. Her emergency beacon was still functioning, though she had no way of knowing if anyone could receive the signal in this storm. More importantly, she had knowledge. She understood how the human body responded to extreme cold, knew the warning signs of hypothermia and frostbite. She knew how to conserve body heat, how to recognize and avoid dangerous terrain, how to find or create shelter in emergency situations. What she didn't know was that the storm was about to teach her things about survival that no textbook had ever covered. The wind was getting stronger, if that was possible. Sarah estimated gusts were now reaching close to 80 miles per hour, strong enough to knock her off her feet if she wasn't careful. The temperature had dropped to at least minus 35 degrees, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. She needed shelter, and she needed it immediately. Sarah began looking for any terrain feature that might provide protection from the wind, a rock outcropping, a stand of trees, even a large snowdrift that she could dig into. But the landscape here was frustratingly flat, offering no obvious shelter. That was when she remembered something from her survival training, something she had learned years ago but never had to use. In extreme conditions, when no natural shelter was available, the best option was often to create your own. Snow, counterintuitively, could be an excellent insulator. If she could dig a shelter into a large drift, the snow itself would help trap her body heat and protect her from the wind. It would be exhausting work in these conditions, but it might be the difference between life and death. Sarah found a drift that looked stable and began digging with the small emergency shovel she carried in her pack. The work was brutal. The snow was packed hard by the wind, and each shovelful required enormous effort. Her hands, even protected by insulated gloves, began to lose feeling within minutes. But she kept digging. She carved out a space just large enough for her body, angled downward so that cold air would flow out while her body heat would be trapped inside. She lined the space with her emergency blanket, creating a reflective barrier that would help retain heat. The shelter wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. Once she crawled inside and sealed the entrance with loose snow, the constant howling of the wind became muffled. The temperature inside was still well below freezing, but it was perhaps 20 degrees warmer than outside. Sarah rationed her food carefully, eating just enough to maintain her energy without depleting her supplies too quickly. She activated hand warmers and placed them inside her jacket, creating pockets of warmth against her core. She did exercises to keep her blood flowing, pressing her arms and legs in the confined space to prevent her muscles from stiffening. But most importantly, she forced herself to think. She was lost, but not necessarily doomed. The storm would eventually pass, and when it did, search teams would be looking for her. Her emergency beacon was still active, broadcasting her location to anyone with the right equipment. She had enough supplies to last at least another day, possibly 2 if she was careful. The key was to stay calm, conserve her energy, and wait for conditions to improve. What Sarah didn't know was that her disappearance had already set in motion a chain of events that would soon make her personal survival seem like a minor concern. The Coast Guard had been notified of her disappearance within hours of the storm clearing enough for Marcus and James to re-establish radio contact. Search and rescue teams were being assembled, but the storm was still too intense for aircraft to safely operate. Ground teams were being organized, but even the most experienced Arctic rescue specialists were reluctant to venture out in conditions this extreme. More significantly, a separate emergency was developing 200 miles away. The Navy SEALs had been missing for over 36 hours. Their helicopter had been overdue for check-in since the previous night, but the storm had prevented any search operations. Military rescue teams were on standby, but like their civilian counterparts, they were grounded by weather conditions that made flying impossible and ground travel nearly suicidal. Lieutenant Commander Hayes and his men were fighting their own battle for survival. They had managed to keep warm by running the helicopter's auxiliary power intermittently, but their fuel was running low. They had food for perhaps another 2 days, but their water supplies were already dangerously low. More concerning was the condition of Petty Officer First Class Tony Morrison, who had suffered a concussion in the crash and was showing signs of a serious head injury. He needed medical attention that they couldn't provide, and his condition was deteriorating. The SEALs were trained for survival, but they were also trained for action. Being forced to wait passively while one of their team members grew sicker was testing their discipline in ways that combat never had. Meanwhile, Sarah was learning lessons about herself that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She had always considered herself a cautious person, someone who avoided unnecessary risks and followed established procedures. Her colleagues often teased her about her methodical approach to everything, her tendency to double-check equipment and triple-check safety protocols. But alone in her snow shelter, listening to the storm rage outside, she discovered reserves of determination and resourcefulness that she hadn't known existed. When her first shelter began to collapse under the weight of accumulating snow, she dug a second one. When her hands became so cold that she couldn't feel her fingers, she forced herself to do exercises until sensation returned. She found herself making decisions based on instinct rather than procedure, trusting her judgment in ways she had never had to before. When her GPS unit began malfunctioning, showing impossible readings that indicated she was somehow moving even while stationary, she turned it off and relied instead on her knowledge of wind patterns and terrain features. The second night was the worst. The storm reached its peak intensity sometime after midnight, with winds that Sarah estimated approached 100 miles per hour. The sound was indescribable, like standing inside a jet engine while someone screamed. Snow found its way into her shelter despite all her precautions, forcing her to constantly clear the entrance to prevent being buried alive. She dozed fitfully, never truly sleeping, always aware that relaxing her vigilance for too long might mean not waking up at all. She told herself stories to stay awake, recited poetry from high school, even sang songs quietly to herself when the howling wind became unbearable. Somewhere during those dark hours, Sarah made a discovery that would change the course of everything that followed. She heard voices. At first, she thought it was her imagination, her mind creating phantom sounds to fill the terrible emptiness of the storm. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that the voices were real. Faint, distorted by the wind, but definitely human. Sarah began digging her way out of her shelter, fighting against snow that had piled up to nearly cover the entrance completely. The voices were coming from somewhere to the east, carried on the wind in fragments that she could barely make out. Need to check on Morrison. Fuel won't last much longer. Where the hell is rescue? Military voices, disciplined, controlled, but with an undercurrent of worry that Sarah recognized as the sound of people in serious trouble. She grabbed her emergency flare gun and fired a single red flare into the storm. The bright light was swallowed almost immediately by the swirling snow, but she thought she heard a change in the voices, a sudden urgency that suggested someone had seen it. Sarah began making her way toward the voices, abandoning her shelter and her carefully rationed supplies. Every survival manual she had ever read would have told her this was insane, that leaving known shelter to search for unknown people in a blizzard was suicide. But somewhere in those lost hours in her snow cave, Sarah Chen had stopped being the type of person who always followed the manual. She had become someone who walked toward voices in a storm, someone who chose to help strangers rather than conserve her own resources, someone who trusted her judgment even when logic said she was making the wrong choice. The journey toward the voices took her 3 hours and nearly killed her twice. She fell into hidden ravines, got turned around in whiteout conditions so complete that she couldn't see her own feet, and came close to giving up more times than she would later admit. But she kept going, following the sound of human voices and the occasional glimpse of light that suggested someone else was out there, someone else who needed help. When she finally saw the dark shape of the crashed helicopter looming out of the snow like some prehistoric monster, Sarah Chen was no longer the same person who had left the research station 2 days earlier. She had become someone capable of miracles. And the 6 Navy SEALs huddled inside that aircraft were about to meet their salvation in the form of a woman they would never be allowed to officially thank, but would never forget. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was the first to see her approach through the storm, a figure moving through the blizzard like a ghost, carrying supplies and wearing civilian Arctic gear that looked inadequate for the conditions. For a moment, he thought he might be hallucinating from cold and exhaustion. But Sarah Chen was real, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what desperate situations require. The rescue was just beginning. Lieutenant Commander David Hayes had seen many impossible things during his 15 years of military service. He had watched soldiers perform acts of heroism that defied logic, had witnessed survival in conditions that should have killed everyone involved, had personally led missions that succeeded despite odds that made failure seem inevitable. But he had never seen anything like the small figure that emerged from the blizzard at 4:37 in the morning, pulling a sled loaded with supplies and moving with the steady determination of someone who belonged in this frozen hell. "Sir, there's someone outside," Petty Officer Rodriguez called from his position by the helicopter's damaged window. "Civilian, I think. Coming this way." Hayes peered through the frost-covered glass and felt his heart skip. In his experience, civilians didn't survive storms like this. They especially didn't go hiking through blizzards pulling sleds full of equipment while wearing gear that looked like it came from a sporting goods store rather than military surplus. The figure stopped about 20 feet from the helicopter and raised what looked like a flare gun. A moment later, a brilliant red flare arced into the storm, its light reflecting off the swirling snow like some kind of Arctic firework. It was a signal. Someone was trying to communicate. Hayes made a decision that probably saved all their lives. Instead of waiting to see what this stranger wanted, he grabbed his own emergency flare and fired it in response. The message was clear. "We see you. We're here. We need help." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in military circles, though it would never appear in any official report. Sarah Chen approached the helicopter with the methodical caution of someone who had spent 2 days learning that every step in this environment could be fatal. She could see faces pressed against the aircraft's windows, could make out military uniforms and equipment. These were soldiers, professional fighting men who should have been better equipped to survive this situation than a civilian meteorologist. The fact that they were signaling for help meant their situation was desperate. Sarah reached the helicopter and knocked on the fuselage with her gloved hand. A moment later, the aircraft's side door slid open with the grinding sound of damaged metal, and she found herself looking into the faces of 6 of the most dangerous men in the world. They looked terrible, exhausted, cold, and worried in a way that professional soldiers rarely allowed themselves to show. One of them, a dark-haired man with lieutenant commander's insignia, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm David Hayes, United States Navy. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. These men were trapped in a crashed helicopter in the middle of an Arctic storm, and their first concern was her welfare. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," she said, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. "Meteorologist. I've been lost in this storm for 2 days. I heard your voices and came to help." Hayes stared at her for a long moment, processing what she had just said. This woman had been lost in a blizzard that was killing experienced soldiers, and she was offering to help them? "Doctor, Code Zorro. Chen, with all due respect, we're trained for survival situations. You should be getting yourself to safety, not worrying about us. Sarah looked past him into the helicopter's interior. She could see 5 other men, all watching her with expressions that mixed hope with professional skepticism. One of them was lying down, clearly injured, while another monitored what looked like radio equipment. "Your friend there," she said, nodding toward the injured man. "He has a concussion, doesn't he? Probably sustained in the crash. He needs medical attention." A's expression sharpened. "How do you know that?" "Because I've seen the symptoms before, and because you're all scared in a way that says, this isn't just about being cold and uncomfortable anymore." She was right, and Hayes knew it. Morrison's condition had been deteriorating throughout the night, and their medical supplies were limited to basic field dressing and pain medication. The concussion was serious enough that he needed real medical care, the kind they couldn't provide in a crashed helicopter. "Dr. Chen," Hayes said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" Sarah pulled her emergency radio from her pack and held it up. "I've been maintaining contact with my research station, intermittent but regular. They know I'm alive, and they know approximately where I am. If we can get a message to them, they can relay our position to search and rescue." "Our communications are down," Rodriguez called from inside the aircraft. "Have been since the crash." "Mine aren't," Sarah replied. "Not completely. I've got about 6 hours of battery life left, and I know the optimal times for transmission when atmospheric conditions are best." What she didn't tell them was that those optimal transmission times occurred during brief lulls in the storm, windows of relative calm that lasted only minutes and were impossible to predict accurately. She would have to stay with them, monitor conditions constantly, and be ready to transmit the moment conditions allowed. It meant abandoning any chance of making it back to her own shelter. It meant committing herself to the survival of 6 strangers. It meant risking her own life for people she had known for less than 10 minutes. Hayes recognized the implications immediately. This woman was offering to sacrifice her own safety for theirs, and she was doing it with the casual, matter-of-factness of someone discussing the weather. "Dr. Chen, if you stay here, you're taking on the same risks we are. Our fuel is limited, our food supplies are running low, and we don't know when rescue will be possible." Sarah looked around at the 6 faces watching her. Men who had probably never asked a civilian for help in their entire careers. She thought about her warm, safe shelter, about her carefully rationed supplies, about the logical decision to preserve her own resources and wait for rescue. Then she thought about the injured man who needed medical attention, about the way these soldiers were trying to hide their growing desperation, about the fact that her radio might be their only hope of communicating with the outside world. "Commander," she said, using his rank for the first time, "I didn't walk through 2 days of this storm just to turn around and leave when I found people who needed help." Hayes made a decision that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his career. He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter the helicopter. "Welcome to the team, Doc." What followed was 36 hours that would test everyone involved in ways they had never imagined. Sarah's presence changed the dynamic inside the helicopter immediately. The SEALs were accustomed to operating as a tight unit, each man knowing his role and trusting the others to perform theirs. Adding a civilian to that equation should have created confusion and inefficiency. Instead, Sarah somehow made everything work better. She had medical training that complemented their first aid knowledge, helping to monitor Morrison's condition and recommend treatment options they hadn't considered. She understood weather patterns in ways that helped them predict when the storm might ease enough for rescue operations. Most importantly, she brought an outside perspective that helped them see solutions they had missed. "Your helicopter's auxiliary power system," she said after examining their fuel consumption calculations. "You've been running it continuously to maintain heat, but if we time the power cycles to coincide with natural temperature fluctuations, we can maintain adequate warmth while extending your fuel supply by at least 12 hours. Sergeant Miller, who had been responsible for managing their power consumption, looked at her calculations and shook his head in amazement. "Doc, where did you learn this?" "Survival in extreme environments is mostly about energy conservation," Sarah replied.
"John, is the Soviet chance tourism amid a day before the sun is captured?"
"I've been doing it professionally for 10 years. But her most important contribution came 18 hours after her arrival, during a brief lull in the storm that lasted exactly 7 minutes. Sarah had been monitoring atmospheric conditions constantly, using equipment cobbled together from her own gear and salvaged helicopter instruments. When the wind dropped and the electromagnetic interference decreased, she was ready. This is Dr. Sarah Chen calling Kotzebue Research Station. She spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the fact that this transmission might be their only chance. I am alive and have located 6 military personnel in need of immediate rescue. Position is approximately 50 miles northeast of Station Bravo. Grid coordinates to follow.